What's Her Name? Women's History Podcast is hosted and produced by academic sisters Dr. Katie Nelson and Olivia Meikle. Committed to reclaiming forgotten history, What's Her Name tells stories of fascinating women you've never heard of, but you should have. Through interviews with historians, writers, scholars, Olivia and Katie bring to life lost women of history. Fascinating and funny, thought-provoking and thoughtful, What's Her Name restores women's voices to the conversation. So on that note, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you guys for coming. As she said, I think I can share my screen. We have pictures for you today to show you what we're talking about as we go. But I am Katie Nelson, and this is my sister, or this is wherever she is on your screen, Olivia Meikle, and we are currently on opposite sides of the Rocky Mountains. A few years ago, we just launched a podcast. We're professors by trade, but Olivia does women's history and or women's studies, and I do world history, and we kind of smashed those things together and decided to start a podcast about women from world history that have been left out of the history books and just dig them up and tell their stories. So it's been a really cool project over the last few years, and it's just growing and growing. I took a lot of convincing at first to convince Olivia that anybody would be interested in women you've never heard of. Like, who's going to listen to stories that they don't know that they care about?
Just because I know how hard it is to get anybody interested in women's history in the first place. And so I didn't have faith, but I was wrong.
It's growing and growing. And if you haven't heard any of our episodes yet, I believe we have, 90 or 100 out there now. So
78.
Oh, 78. Then you can find us on any podcast server and YouTube and Spotify and everything. So today what we decided to do was to just give a kind of quick, I was going to say overview, but it's more like just a frenzied race through history, telling you about women who changed the world that nobody has ever heard of. And really, all it takes, from my perspective, all it takes is to tell one of these stories to people, and then they realize, wow, it's true. It's true. There really are so many overlooked women in history who really did big things, but the people writing the books didn't write that down, didn't perceive that to be important at the time. So what we're going to do is kind of bounce back and forth between Olivia and me. We're going to tell you about 4 women from history that nobody has ever heard of. I had not heard of all of them. It could be I were like barely in passing, and I'm a world history professor, but I had only barely heard of them before starting this podcast. Now I realize what a big deal they are. So buckle up. We are just going to rocket through some of the coolest stories of these amazing women. And if you want to know more, of course, there's a lot more out there. This can be, of course, really casual. So if you have any declarations of amazement or questions or anything like that, just go ahead and throw them in the chat or interrupt me. We don't stand on formality. Speaking of which, do you have anything else, Olivia, to add before we just launch into our amazing ladies?
I think you got it.
Okay, let's do it then. Okay, so we each chose 2 that we were fascinated with. I started out with Bouboulina. She is a woman who just sprang to mind to me immediately. She always is when someone says, give me an example of a woman who changed the world, or just a woman from history that everybody should know about, but they don't. And for me, it's Bouboulina. So her story begins in a prison in Constantinople in 1770, maybe 1771, something like that. So we're at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. And at this point, the Ottoman Empire controls like almost everything touching the Mediterranean. And there's, can you see my cursor? You can? Okay. There's Constantinople right there. And she was born in a prison there. to a mother and a father who was imprisoned and was doomed to die, and a mother who visited her imprisoned husband and gave birth in the prison. So as soon as she was born, her dad died. She's fatherless, she's fortuneless, she's, deemed an enemy of this state. She's a nobody from nowhere. But somehow she had that spark. She also nursed a very profound resentment of the Ottoman Empire, and somehow, against all odds, she went on to make a fortune, and she used that fortune to build a fleet and launch a revolution against the Ottoman Empire. She's sort of the George Washington of Greece. She single-handedly, I'm going to say, started the Greek Revolution in 1821. Her story is bonkers from start to finish. Once she made it, she actually was the wife on the island of Spetses. It's right here. She's the wife of a sea captain. He was a merchant tradesman, and he was killed by pirates at sea. So she remarried another sea captain who was also killed by pirates at sea. And the third time around, she has 7 children. She's widowed. She's 37 years old. She decides she's going to become the sea captain herself, and she's going to not die at sea, and she's going to succeed. So she did, and she got crazy rich, and she then spent her fortune building the AGAMEMNON. It's the largest warship of the Greek Revolution, and she started to secretly amass the weapons of war. She was planning to rebel against the Ottoman Empire. She funded it all entirely herself. She stockpiled weapons, hid them in her house. She eventually built a fleet of ships. She recruited a navy. Everything was funded 100% by her. She paid their salaries. She fed them everything. And in 1821, on her flagship, the AGAMEMNON, she raised the very first flag of the Greek Revolution. And she personally launched this revolution herself. This is actually her telescope. It's in a museum in Athens. And here we are zoomed in on Greece. So she comes from the island of Spetses, which is here. And she set sail in 1821 to attack a giant castle, this fortified castle that was an Ottoman stronghold just up the coast from where she lived. She attacks the Ottoman castle at Nafplio, and there's a famous painting of this moment. And I absolutely love it because you can see the striking parallel to our story of George Washington. This similarity in the scene, it's not a coincidence. We actually don't know which one of these was painted first, but it very well could have been the Bouboulina painting that was painted first. This is her staging her invasion of Nafplio, and this is what she's so famous for. She's standing, looking boldly and fiercely ahead. All of her men are terrified. They are asking her to turn around and go back. This is a lost cause. And she says, no, we are going to attack and stop being so cowardly. And she became famous for that. The attack at Nafplio, it actually turned into a siege that lasted for like a year and a half. So while that is going on, she also led her troops on land. She attacked by sea, she attacked by land. She's famous for having a sword, which she could wield very well. She rode on the back of a white stallion, and she personally decapitated many, many men. We don't even know how many. She rode at the front of her troops. This is a fierce and pretty terrifying lady. In the end, one of the things she is most famous for is a battle called Tripoli. The War of the Greek Revolution is famous for its ruthlessness. It's brutal. It's horrific, nightmarish conditions on both sides, massacres of entire villages. Hundreds, if not thousands, of women committed suicide by entire towns because they didn't want to be captured by the enemies. And Tripoli is right in the center, right about here. And this is one of the most brutal battles of the war. After days of siege, the Greek troops finally took Tripoli. And when they broke into the city, 25,000 people lay dead in the streets. This is a total massacre. And when the Greeks, and Bouboulina was there, she's like right alongside them fighting. But when they broke into the palace of the Sultan, he's like the governor of Tripoli, Bouboulina, as she's busting through the palace with her sword, she comes across the Sultan's wife and all the women in the harem. And they begged her to save their lives. They said, "This isn't our fight, please save us." And Bouboulina turned around famously and wielded her sword in defense of the women of the harem and ordered her men not to touch them. Every last woman in the palace got away with Bouboulina leading them to freedom. And she saved her enemies that were women. That's sort of at the core of her legend now, that story. So she is a kind of incredible twist on the George Washington story, but her end isn't quite as glorious as George Washington. She was such a national hero. She very well could have been made the first president, but instead, she went back home to her island of Spetses, and a feuding neighbor family came to argue with her over the fact that their daughter had run off with her son and eloped. And so she stuck her head out the window. She's shouting down at this family. She's just a very fierce lady, so she's telling them what she thinks. She's not messing around. And they're so annoyed and angry at her. One of them, they don't know who it was, pulled out a gun and shot her in the head. And that was the ignoble and sudden end of Bouboulina. But when the Russian Tsar, so this is like 1825, when the Russian Tsar heard that Bouboulina had died in such an ignoble way, he declared that he named her Rear Admiral of the Russian Navy for what she had achieved against their old enemy, the Greeks. And she is, up until very recently, she's the only female admiral in the history of the world. Greece gained its freedom. Greece began to give public education to girls for the very first time in Greek history. This is the actual school which they set up in Athens at the Acropolis to signify that this is the home of where Athena, the goddess of wisdom, dwells. And they set up this school. So this is a direct result of Bouboulina showing Greece what a empowered woman can do, the power of a fierce female. She was modeling that for the first time and absolutely changed the history of the Mediterranean because of her bold, extreme actions. So Bouboulina is somebody, I mean, I was in Greece and I had never heard of her until I randomly met someone who was from Spetses who told me her story. And it's just so fascinating. I wish everybody knew about her. Okay, so that's our first incredible world changer. Olivia, should we bounce it to you? Oh, I have to stop sharing mine, don't I? There.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry, I'm on two screens, which is always confusing. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about Nur Jahan, who Katie had heard of, but I had never heard of when I started researching her. She is the only empress in the Mughal Empire, Mughal Empire history, and debatably in Indian history. She was the wife of Emperor Jahangir, and she was quite amazing. So here's the Mughal Empire at its peak. We're here, most of the Indian subcontinent, most of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan. It was big. And this is Nur Jahan. Here she is holding a portrait of her husband after he died to show her devotion. She was a very snappy dresser, as you can tell, and she actually became a fashion icon on top of everything else I'm about to tell you. But she was most famous because she, much like Bouboulina, didn't believe in following the rules about what women were supposed to do or be like. And her husband was a big fan of her, as you can tell. So she had a lot of power and influence, but their story actually begins before, when her husband is a teenager. He fell in love with her, but she was already married. She's already married to a low-level government employee. So the story goes, we can't verify what happened. The story goes that they did have an affair, and then she is shipped off with her husband to the absolute wild west of Bengal, which at the time was just the absolute back of beyond, as far away as possible. And she lives there for 10 years, has several children, but when her husband gets on the wrong side of the political situation and dies, she comes back to Agra and is immediately brought back in, or brought into, Emperor Jahangir's harem, and 3 years later marries him, which is really unusual and astonishing. But she didn't behave like an empress should, like the wife of a Mughal emperor definitely should. She really loved to play polo. So here she is playing polo with many of her friends. She was apparently extremely good at polo. She was extremely athletic. She was extremely independent. She possibly, while in that back of beyond Bengal, had become really excellent at shooting. So muskets are a new thing, and they're very in and popular. And she is, she commissions this portrait of herself dressed in kind of men's clothes, but with female touches, but definitely not anything that a woman would have been wearing, and loading her own musket. So she's not only going hunting, she's not doing, genteel ladylike hunting. She's loading her own muskets. She is extremely skilled at all of these skills, which are really highly valued, which is good news for the kingdom and for her husband, because her husband is not super great at those things, maybe because he is an alcoholic, maybe because he's ill, maybe both, but he pretty quickly becomes not very effective as an emperor, and Nur Jahan has to take over. So she is in all ways, by the end, doing what an emperor should do. This is absolutely astonishing. Women do not do this, and yet she is. And it's so astonishing that nobody wrote these things down. Nobody wanted to make a record of the fact that this woman is breaking all of these rules so much. So we modern scholars have had to uncover what actually was going on based on contextual clues. Like, for example, the fact that this is the only coin in the Mughal emperor that has a woman's name on it. This is Nur Jahan's name and Jahangir's name on both sides of this coin. This is something that only emperors can do. Only emperors put their name on a coin, and Nur Jahan's name is on this coin. She is signing executive orders and has her own seal that isn't her husband's seal, it's her seal, and she's the one officially endorsing all of these executive orders and rules. She is very clearly the one in charge. But my favorite proof that she is actually the boss is that there is a very specific rule in the Mughal Empire that only an emperor is allowed to kill a tiger. No one else is ever allowed to kill a tiger. So if there is a man-eating tiger on the rampage somewhere in the empire, you have to phone in to Agra and ask the emperor to please come and kill this tiger for you. And when this happened throughout the empire, often it was Nur Jahan who would set off, because Jahangir was incapacitated, and so she would be the one setting off to go and kill these man-eating tigers. And on one occasion, there were, in fact, 4 man-eating tigers in one area, and she killed all 4 of them with 6 musket shots from the top of an elephant. Now, if anyone has ever fired an old-fashioned musket, or even any old-fashioned firearm of any kind, they're not very accurate. They're incredibly difficult. And to add to all the chaos of this, just imagine what an elephant is probably going to be acting like if there are 4 tigers running around and you are shooting muskets from atop it. This is a pretty not calm situation. And yet she manages to kill all 4 tigers with 6 shots. She has cemented her legacy forever in the Mughal Empire and in history with just this one action. But this is just one of the incredible, amazing things that she did. When her husband was kidnapped as part of a ploy to overthrow, the Mughal Empire was very unstable, and they're pretty much constantly trying to kill each other, sons, brothers, uncles, cousins. So her husband is kidnapped by someone who wants to take over the empire, and rather than send the army, she decides she's going to go rescue him. So she jumps on another elephant, sets off into the war, just goes straight to the front of the line, gets captured, and the man who is holding her husband captive is really thrilled. Now he's got both of them. Of course, he doesn't realize that now she's on the inside of his compound, and she stages a revolution. She convinces their entire guard to come to their side and escapes and takes the entire army with her back to Agra, where they rule for another 20 years. She was a pretty unstoppable force. As you can see here, she also had a pretty important impact on Indian architecture. This building might look a little bit familiar to you. It's known as the Baby Taj. It is the precursor of the Taj Mahal, the most famous, maybe most famous building in the world. This is the tomb that she designed for her parents. And this was an absolute dramatic change from all Indian architecture before that. And it was her. She's the one who starts using these forms, this white marble. And this is her tomb. So this is much more traditional, what traditional architecture was at the time. So this is where Nur Jahan is eventually buried. But this is the legacy that she leaves in architecture. She becomes a fashion icon. Everything is turned upside down. And if she had not rescued her husband, and if she had not been involved at every stage of his entire rule, it's incredibly likely that the Mughal Empire would not have survived his rule and would have ended 200 years before it finally ends in the 1800s. So she absolutely changed the entire history of Asia forever. And yet 99% of people outside of India have never heard her name. Katie?
Okay, continuing our whirlwind tour. I cannot share my screen while the other participant is sharing. You want to just run the slides?
Oh, I thought I stopped.
Oh, did you? Oh, you did.
Okay.
Okay. All right, continuing our whirlwind tour, we will now go to Mexico. And one of the most earth-shaking moments in world history, the conquest of Mexico. And if you know anything about the conquest of Mexico, the names probably spring to mind, like Cortez, Montezuma, the AZTECs. But in the big picture, this is one of the biggest moments in world history, I think, because it resulted in nothing short of the erasure of an entire continent and then repopulating that continent with people from other places. The death rate among Native Americans in Central, South, and North America was probably 90%. So this was a earth-shaking moment. And often when you hear the story of the conquest of Mexico, you hear about the Spanish and you hear about the Portuguese and the conquistadors who came over and smashed everybody to bits. But in Mexico, there's a different figure at the center of this story. And she today is so interesting to me because her name is Malintzin, and this is her. This is Cortez. She has been called the greatest traitor in human history, but she has also been celebrated as the icon of empowered women. She has been described as the ultimate victim. And she has also been described as the ultimate villain or hero. History is pretty confused about Malintzin. And that's because she was a real human in a real complicated situation. But what we can say for sure about Malintzin, in hindsight, is that The conquest of the Americas succeeded because of her. Had she not been there, Cortez would have died right off the bat. His entire campaign would have utterly failed. She is really the one that's responsible for the total downfall of the Aztec or Mexica Empire. But she was a native of the Aztec Empire. And so that's what makes her so interesting. She came from, okay, so this is the Aztec Mexica Empire. So we call them Aztec. Now we know they called themselves the Mexica. So nowadays the terms are used interchangeably. So it's all of this, the yellow, orange, and the purple. That's the Aztec Empire. And she was born down here in modern day Veracruz. And she was, when she was maybe 12, 13 years old, she was sold by her people to a neighboring tribe as a sex slave. And as she grew up, as she came into her teens, she was sold and given multiple times. And back then that was a normal practice as part of peace negotiations and all kinds of gestures between tribes. They would just give girls to and from each other. Eventually she ends up in Maya territory over here. This is the dark green area. She was sold to a group of Maya, one of 20 girls who was sold to the Maya. And she was there also again as a sex slave when history intervened in her life story, because on the coast of Maya territory landed this fateful man named Hernan Cortez. This is him with his fleet of ships ready to stage an invasion of Mexico. He and his ragtag group of Spaniards were completely over their heads. They had no knowledge of the rainforest. They had no survival skills. They didn't know what they could eat and what was going to poison them. They were just completely useless, but ambitious. And they landed and said, "We shall conquer this area." And among the very first negotiations they made with the first tribe that they made was arranging for women to be given to them as well. And Malintzin was one of the women that was given to these invading Spaniards. What was going on in her head? This is the ultimate question we always want to know. Did she hate her people? Maybe she owes them nothing because they sold her into slavery. Maybe she sees them and she goes, "This is my ticket out." Or maybe she says, this is the only way that I can take control of my own life. Whatever it was, she got to know Cortez and she learned Spanish as quickly as she could. She realized she had a gift for languages. She could speak her native dialect, she could speak Maya, and she was picking up Spanish very quickly. And Cortez said, "I really need somebody like you. If I'm going to conquer the whole of Central America, then I'm going to need somebody who can communicate with all the people that I'm conquering." And so she attaches her fate to his. So she's often just, when you see her in history books, she's called the translator for Cortez. And I guess she was that, I mean, kind of, but she's so much more than a translator for Cortez. She's his chief advisor. She is telling him what to do all the time. She's coming up with all of his strategies. She is his lover slash mistress, the mother of his children, the mastermind behind everything, and the central communicator in every single moment in the entirety of the conquest of Mexico. She is literally the only one who understands what everybody is saying. And she's the central figure translating every message between everybody, which means she has all the power, right? They don't know if she's translating accurately what they said. She could say anything that she wanted and they would never know. And so she comes up in the Spaniards' records. The Spanish soldiers that were with Cortez talk about her a lot, and they're always amazed by her. They say she's incredible, she's a genius, she's beautiful, she's fierce and terrifying. But also we see her from the Aztec perspective when they draw scenes where they met Cortez for the first time. And in every single one of those instances, you can see here, she is always there. She's always in the picture, and she's usually presented as bigger than Cortez. And that's not like a artistic inability. That's them saying she is the most important person in the picture. She's always pointing or talking. She's clearly giving directions, telling them what to do. She is always, always there. Here she is again, pointing out, go over here and slaughter these people. She came up with some very genius schemes which involved massacring entire villages. Like, this is not some sweet little lady who's like, let's just talk everybody into it. She has got some incredible schemes, and it keeps working and it keeps working. She saved Cortez's life over and over and over again, until eventually they've worked their way from Maya territory all the way up to the capital city, Tenochtitlan, where the Emperor Montezuma lives. And they met in this fateful meeting that I would just die to be a fly on the wall to be there in this moment. Cortez, here's the causeway that goes out across the lake to Tenochtitlan. It's this incredible city. Like, the Europeans could hardly believe their eyes that it was such a amazingly sophisticated place with engineering miracles. And Montezuma and Cortez, they actually met on the causeway for the very first time, and Malintzin is there. She is translating these two guys' messages to each other, between each other. And the Spaniards' records say that Montezuma begins in a very formal tone, and then when Malintzin translates Cortez's reaction, she translates it as basically shouting and terrifying, yelling in his face. And that was her personal choice. So she really is controlling the narrative at all moments. But of course, we know what happened. We know how this went down. After Cortez and Malintzin get into the city, it's over. Poof! The Aztec Empire is gone. It's basically utterly erased off the face of the planet. Malintzin has a large house outside of the city. She is honored, she is powerful, and she gives birth to Martin, who is Cortez's son. He is often presented as the beginning of the mestizo race of the vast majority of Mexicans today. So her story, I mean, I would just love to go and meet her in that moment, to just knock on her door and say, what on earth do you make of this? And how do you see all of this playing out? And what is going on in your head? But we will never know, because she never wrote anything down. We don't have her perspective at all. All we have are the Spaniards' accounts, and we have these drawings. And so she has become a figure that has been turned into all kinds of characters. She's called La Malinche in Mexico still today. It's the ultimate byword. Call somebody a Malinche means like a culture betrayer. She's the ultimate villain in Mexican history, seen as betraying and taking down her people. But then later people said, no, actually, she's the victim here. She didn't know them anything. You know, if anything, she was just trying to survive. Some people celebrate her as this powerhouse. And there's a lot of conflict and confusion about her. Recently, they tried to put up a statue of her in Mexico City, but there was so much protest that they had to kind of shove it away and hide it on the outskirts of town where nobody would see it. And so most of my Hispanic students whose parents are from Mexico, when they learn about her, they're amazed. They go home and they talk to their parents about her, and their parents are like, oh, we know all about her. We learned about how horrific she was in school. She's the ultimate worst. But the next generation is looking at her in a really different light. She's such a fascinating character. So this is the painting of the dream of La Malinche, where she is actually the birth of the modern day Mexico and the modern day Mexican story. Fascinating, fascinating character. Okay, last but not least, Olivia.
All right. We're heading south to meet Anita Garibaldi. And several hundred years later, Anita Garibaldi, another one that I had never heard of at all. And yet she is extremely, extremely, extremely famous in Brazil, and also Uruguay, and also Italy. In fact, she's known as the mother of Italy. Now, how did a Brazilian gaucho, extremely poor child bride become the mother of Italy? Well, this is where Anita Garibaldi grew up. This is still her house, still standing, which is amazing. She was a gaucho, so where cowboy culture comes from is very much gaucho culture, riding, shooting animals, very rough and tumble. And she fully embraced that, to the dismay of her mother, who really was concerned about her and kept saying that she had a man's eyes, whatever that means, that when she looked in her eyes, she saw a man, and she was really worried about it. Presumably it means that she wouldn't keep sweet and be quiet. So her mother married her off at 14 years old to a pretty despicable man. But when he went off, when the Brazilian Revolution began, the Ragamuffin War, it's often called, her husband ran off to fight on behalf of the government, and she was left alone. And so when this dashing fellow, Giuseppe Garibaldi, arrived on a ship and saw her from afar, and instantly, the legend says, saw her standing on a balcony, said, "I have to marry that woman," dived off the ship, swam into the port, and immediately ran to marry her. The truth is that he didn't dive off the ship, but he did see her, say, "I have to marry her," and immediately begin pursuing her. She was super happy to join up with him. She really did not like her life and didn't like where she was. And so when this man who had been exiled from Italy for starting too many wars and political turmoil, and decided, well, I hear there's lots of good revolutions in South America. So he just set off to South America to join up with whatever fight he could find. He really liked revolution. And they fell deeply, passionately in love, and she was by his side forever. So of course the Ragamuffin War is going on, and so he's joining up, she's heading with him, and they quickly become extremely powerful and well-known leaders within this Ragamuffin War. This is Anita. While in Brazil, she still would fight wearing women's clothes, but eventually she started wearing men's clothes. And she was known as just an unstoppable force. She was an incredibly skilled horsewoman, and she actually taught Giuseppe riding, shooting, all of these skills. And she was ideally suited for this type of a guerrilla warfare. Really absolutely believed that her destiny was to become an incredibly important figure in the revolution alongside her husband. And so she believed that she could not be stopped. She could not be killed. So she would do absolutely bananas things. Like, she was, the most famous story about her, she's in the middle of this huge battle. She is captured. They bring her husband's poncho, which is covered in blood, and they said, "He's dead. You have to give up. It's over." And she doesn't believe he's dead. And so she says, "Fine, let me go find his body. And if I can see his body, let me see his body, and then I'll believe you." And they said, "Well, he's out there on the field somewhere. You'll have to go find him." Thinking, of course, she won't. This is ridiculous. But she does. She says, "Fine." And they let her go. They let her out of the tent to go find the body of her husband among the hundreds of people dead on the battlefield. The battle is still going on also. She's wandering around during the battle trying to find her husband's body. Once she realizes he's not here, he's not dead, she steals a horse, gallops right through the middle of the battle, gallops directly at the enemy line and the cannons, right into the cannons, goes directly through them. Her horse is shot out from under her. So she runs, they're chasing her. She runs and dives into the river, this huge river. And the people, they know she's dead. Obviously she's dead. So they just leave, they leave. It's a massive roaring river in the middle of battle. She is not dead. She swims across this huge river, comes up on the other side, the horse has rolled over on top of her also, by the way, and she has a broken leg. And she's swimming this river with a broken leg. She is wandering around on the other side of the river for 3 days with no food, until she finally finds some nuns who feed her and take her in. These little ladies take her in and feed her, and then tell her that in fact her husband is not dead. And she goes off to find him and is reunited with him, and they carry on in the revolution. And also, by the way, did I mention that she's 8.5 months pregnant while all of that happens? She's stealing a horse, galloping into the cannons, horses rolling over her, swimming through raging rivers, 8 months pregnant. It's baffling and mind-boggling. And her husband was so just proud and thrilled that he couldn't stop talking about these stories about her, but she didn't really think they were anything at all. She was so unimpressed with what she did that she would just sort of offhandedly mention, oh yeah, when that happened, and then be surprised that people were surprised. When the Brazilian Revolution finally is over, of course, Giuseppe has to set off for a new one. So they run off to Uruguay, get involved in the Uruguayan War. There she is, here they are, she and Giuseppe, and here's the Ragamuffin War. Then they set off for the Uruguayan War. This is an image of this church here is where all of the people in this entire city, all of the women and children have been sent to hide in this church. And Anita Garibaldi is in charge. She's not just in charge of the women and children, she's in charge of the entire war strategy effort. She's running all of the food. She's in charge of the supply lines. But at this moment, there's a siege on this church. She is the one there standing in front of the church and basically daring them, saying, if you want to get in here, if you want to kill these people in here, you will have to go through me first. And they were so scared and impressed by her that they left. They just left. And she defeated the entire battalion because nobody wanted to be the one that tried to kill this force of nature that was unkillable. And so she saved everyone, all of the women and children in the entire village hiding in this church. Here she is in her awesome outfit again. Then Giuseppe Garibaldi is invited back to Italy. So off they go to Italy and start a new revolution in Italy. All of the Italian states, which are not Italy yet, are warring, trying to form a united country and also kick out the Pope. And that's Giuseppe Garibaldi's main goal, is to kick out the Pope and make this a secular state. And so they are laying siege against Rome for months and months and months. He calls his armies the Red Shirts, which is based on the gaucho uniform of this red shirt and white pants that Anita Garibaldi actually introduced him to. And eventually they do, and they kick the Pope out of Rome, and Rome becomes a secular state for the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years. And in 1849, the first Roman Republic in thousands of years is founded. But on the way back, and Anita Garibaldi is again there at the forefront on the horse with the sword, with the gun. She keeps having babies and she'll send them to live with her. She'll take them to her mother-in-law and then come back to the front. And they're on retreat. The French army is chasing them out of Rome, and she is infected with malaria, and she dies on this retreat out of Rome. And Giuseppe Garibaldi is absolutely devastated by this. He doesn't really even know how to function without her. They've been so passionately dedicated to each other. There's lots of images. There's lots of images of her death, and none of this charge at the cannons, which I find baffling. But he really was devastated and was not the same after her death. But she becomes this really important figure, and even now in Italy is known as the Mother of Italy. Many people in Italy know who she is, and there are statues of her all over the place. So these two are in Brazil. There are also statues in Uruguay. She's known as a national hero in 3 countries. And I like these ones. Here she is leading the people. There's her gun. Here she is protecting Giuseppe Garibaldi. But my absolute favorite one is this one, which is on the Janiculum Hill in Rome. And that's her on top in the greatest statue ever. She is on her horse, rearing back. She has her gun in the air. She's just the best, most powerful cowgirl hero ever. But what I didn't realize until I started looking at closer images of this is that she also has a baby in her arms on this statue. That this is her infant son on the battlefield charging, and this is actually her grave as well. Her ashes, in a weird turn of events, Mussolini wanted to co-opt her story, so he went and took her ashes and had her interred in this statue and tried to claim her as this fascist heroine, which she absolutely would have hated, and so it's very odd. But if you're ever in Rome, you can go and see this statue of her, visit her grave, and just enjoy the story of this totally unexpected, bizarre cowgirl, mother of Italy hero.
Every time I hear her story, I think that sounds like made up. That can't possibly even be true.
Write it. You couldn't, if you wrote it as a novel, people would think you were ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many stories like that. So these were our top 4 picks for women that we wish the whole world knew about, because their stories are so stranger than fiction and so marvelous.
Yeah. And that literally the course of human history would not be the same without them.
Yeah, these stories were amazing. And you added so many details that I think enrich them, like when you're talking about, I'm sorry, I can't remember her real name. I've heard her in Mesoamerican be La Malinche, how she's bigger in all the photos. And I've heard about her and I've read about her. I've never noticed that. So that was there's so many details like that. So we only have a couple minutes left. So I want to get to student or attendee questions or comments. If you guys want to drop anything in the chat or unmute yourself or get on camera, we're happy to take your questions. We have a little over 10 minutes left.
And we can talk about like the podcast in general or women's history stuff in general too. We don't have to just talk about these 4.
Yeah, maybe while people are typing, could you share how you pick who you're going to feature on the podcast?
Sure. Yeah, at the beginning, we decided that it was we knew that people are interesting when they're interested. And so we decided that rather than choose subjects, we would choose guests. And so we reached out to people that we knew would be really good guests and just asked them who they wanted to talk about. Because if we pick the topics, then that feels like we're curating. But if people are just really excited to talk about someone, they're way more interesting, and that's definitely proved true. So at the beginning, we were just asking people that we knew would be interesting guests. Now that since it has really taken off, we have lots and lots of people coming to us, which is great. We have publishers and scholars and people coming to us to ask if they can be on it, which is always a good problem to have, that we have to say no a lot, which is a weird problem to have, but like we can't have any more white American ladies for a long time. And so we have that we get to just sort of see what people bring to us. But then also one of the things that we're both really passionate about, like when Katie said at the beginning, we don't stand on formality, very much so. Like we don't stand for gatekeeping knowledge. And so sometimes our guests are the premier scholar of this thing who's published 8 books, and sometimes our guests are the guy that Katie ran into in the rainforest in Cobal, who had spent his life researching his own family's history, or this woman who works in the hotel where this person used to live, or just anyone that we can find who knows a lot about this person we want to talk to, and that you don't have to have a qualification to know stuff. Everybody knows stuff that you don't know, and we should all start listening more to people who are living the history, especially rather than studying it from afar. And I'm not joking, like Katie's our last episode, Katie literally ran into a stranger in the rainforest, and that's the guest on the episode.
Those are my favorite.
Yeah.
There's a real travel element in our episodes also, just because I teach study abroad and we're both sort of travel addicts. And so most of my episodes I will record abroad somewhere. I'll just go to the place and find experts there and just connect with people there and then record the interview on the fly. So like Bouboulina, I had never heard of her. Having taught Greek history and everything, I was there on a Greek history study abroad teaching my students. I had never heard of her until this woman that I met. She was on her way back to Spetses, this island. And she said, it's known as Bouboulina's island. Bouboulina, she's one of our national heroes. And I was like, she? Wait, what? Who? And just totally caught her off guard. And she was on her way back home, but I was like, do you have 20 minutes to just hurry and record an interview with me? I have to have this story. It's amazing. So
You
we try
did
to
that interview in your swimsuit, as I recall,
Yes,
right?
I did. I was in my swimming suit ready to go snorkel over a sunken city, but I had to grab her and sit down outside the hotel and just record it really fast. So I try to evoke that sense of travel and spontaneity in the episode also. So you kind of feel like you're there with me and that we're, traipsing through the rainforest, or we're there sitting there in Greece, things like that. It's a fun creative challenge also.
And an excuse to travel more, which neither of us need, but we'll always take.
I know this recording is going to be shared with a podcasting class. I was wondering if you could tell us about, like, what is the pre-work for an episode?
Oh.
Countless hours, but we chose
60
the
hours.
hardest. Yeah. The format of ours is pretty hard. Podcasts run the gamut from just you just record a conversation and then put it on your feed and you're done. And that's not very hard. I think anybody can do that. It doesn't require much money. Anybody can start a podcast. But once you get, and that's one of the great parts of the democratization of media these days. I think that there are no more gatekeepers. If you have something to say, just say it. Start a podcast. You need a microphone and you put it up on your feed. That's pretty much it. But we do a lot of more production in ours, and we have multiple layers. So there's we record the interview with the scholar, but then I will report back on that with Olivia, and we record that, and then we flash back and forth between the interview and our conversation about it. We always add era appropriate music, so it's different music every episode that matches the time period and the place that it comes from. And so we just we gave ourselves all this extra work.
Yeah.
So, it's like hundreds of hours.
It really is. And that's just the
Believe it or not.
podcast. And then we, stupidly decided that we should do a big fancy website and all of these extra things, and which none of which we have to do, but we like.
Olivia makes trading cards of all the What'sHerName women that we've featured, and she makes subversive cross-stitch patterns so you can cross-stitch these badass ladies from history. So there's all kinds of those. There they are. Look, oh yeah, I've got one.
Look,
too.
There's Bouboulina.
Yes.
Nobody else is on there that we talked about.
So anybody can do a podcast, and you can participate at whatever level you want. It can be a minimal thing, or you can allow it to take over your life.
Yeah.
Whatever you choose.
Well, I think I'll just have us wrap it up with this last question. Is there anything, themes or skills or whatever, that you've learned about women having as you've been doing this podcast that you're like, I'm really going to incorporate, this attitude or approach, that basically something you've taken away from what you learned on the podcast?
One of the themes that always emerges for me is, especially in history, most of these women are living in a really sexist world where the expectation was you're not going to do much with your life. You're going to obey the rules and be quiet and domestic. And so many times in history, all the times, women were not doing that. They were breaking the rules and going, I think I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. And so our narrative is that in history, women, they're not in the history books because they didn't do much. But that's not at all true. Just like today, all of us are like, I think I'm going to do what I want. And I think throughout history, women have always been doing that.
Yeah, I always end up yelling, women have always done stuff. Always. There's never been a time when women weren't doing stuff. We got a really nice email from a listener in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago that really made me think about this question, because she was talking about how listening to the podcast and all these women who just did stuff, they just decided to do it and do what they want and not ask permission. And she said, I know this sounds silly because it's a small thing. It's not like I'm going to go change the world, but she said she'd always wanted to learn the hurdy-gurdy, which is like it looks like a big violin with a crank, and then you hit keys. It's amazing. So everyone should go watch a hurdy-gurdy video if you haven't heard of it. She always wanted to learn the hurdy-gurdy, and she said, after listening to your podcast for a year, I finally decided I'm going to do it, and I signed up for lessons yesterday. And I almost cried, which was weird because I thought, that's my goal, that people learn the hurdy-gurdy because they listened to our podcast. You don't have to, take over, form a new nation of Italy or kick out the Pope. You can do that thing that you've always wanted to do that you just never gave yourself permission to do, because people should do what they want. The end.
Amen.
That's my self-help book. You should do what you want.
Awesome. Thank you so much for presenting. I think our participants got a lot out of it. I know I was like, for every person, I was just like, wow, like it was really cool. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope that everyone who tuned in today will be listening to your podcast. We've gotten lots of really positive comments in the chat. So we really appreciate you. And thank you for helping us honor women during this Women's History Month.